branches whispering secrets carried by the wind. At first glance, life here seems peaceful, farmers tending their fields, children playing near the river, families gathering as dusk settles in. Yet beneath that calm surface, an unspoken fear lingers in every heart, for deep within that forest there is a shadow, a creature whose very presence has shaped the way villagers live their lives. A snake, poisonous, swift, unpredictable. Its hiss is enough to send shivers down the spine of even the bravest hunter. No one dares to wander too far into the trees. Paths are avoided. Nightfall is dreaded. In every story told around the fire, the snake is there, a symbol of danger, a reminder that safety is never guaranteed. But here's the question: is the true poison found only in the serpent's fangs, or does it also seep into the minds of those who live in fear? This story is not just about a snake, nor about a village trapped in terror. It is about something far deeper, something that lives inside each of us. The snake, with its venom and its unpredictable strikes, is more than an animal. It is anger, it is hatred, it is the bitterness we sometimes hold in our hearts. And just like the villagers, we often find ourselves building lives shaped by fear of what lurks within and around us. Yet within this very forest of fear, another presence appears, not with weapons, not with fire, but with something far more powerful: compassion. The kind of compassion that does not tremble before fangs or run from darkness, but meets it face to face and transforms it. This is where the story begins. A poisonous snake feared by all, a village suffocated by dread, and a traveler, a monk, who dares to see not only the danger, but also the potential for change. What unfolds is not merely a tale of good versus evil. It is a journey into the very heart of Buddhism, the belief that compassion is not weakness, but the greatest strength, that no poison is too strong to be healed, that even the most terrifying shadow can become a source of light if met with the right mind and heart. As you listen, I invite you to imagine the forest around you, the rustle of leaves, the echo of a distant hiss, the tension that makes even the bravest villager hesitate at the tree line. Feel the weight of that fear. And then step into the story. Walk with the monk, face the snake. Discover what happens when compassion meets venom and kindness faces down fear. Because in the end, this is not just the story of a snake, it is the story of us all. The forest looms like a dark curtain behind the village. And though the sun rises each morning, the people here never truly awaken without the shadow of dread pressing on their chests. Every crack of a branch, every sudden rustle of leaves carries the same thought: the snake is near. Farmers till their land, but always with one eye on the tree line. Mothers tell their children not to wander too far, their voices trembling even when they try to sound firm. Merchants traveling through the village quicken their pace when they hear the tales, stories of animals found lifeless, of hunters never returning, of a venom so lethal it brings death within moments. Fear shapes the rhythm of life. The villagers build their homes closer together as though proximity will protect them. Fires burn late into the night, not for warmth, but to create a fragile circle of safety against the unknown. And still, beneath the glow of the flames, the whispers continue. What if the snake strikes again? Who will it take next? But perhaps the most dangerous thing is not the snake itself. It is what fear does to the human mind. It corrodes, it narrows vision, it creates suspicion, resentment, and division. Some villagers argue that they should hunt the snake, though none are brave enough to try. Others insist that angering it further will bring disaster. Disagreement turns into conflict. Even in moments when the serpent is nowhere to be seen, its presence is felt, because fear has already taken root inside every heart. Buddhist teachings often speak of three poisons: greed, hatred, and ignorance. Here in this small village, one can see how a single shadow, a single threat can awaken one of those poisons: hatred. Not hatred only toward the snake, but toward each other, toward life itself, toward the helplessness they cannot escape. Fear has become their prison, and the venom of the snake flows not only through its fangs, but through the very thoughts of those who live under its shadow. Imagine carrying that burden every day. Imagine children growing up never knowing the freedom of running through fields without glancing over their shoulders. Imagine elders who sit by the fire each night, telling younger generations to stay small, stay safe, never step too far into the world. A whole life dictated by the unseen movements of a creature hiding in the forest. And yet, fear always carries within it the seed of transformation. For when fear grows unbearable, the heart begins to search. The villagers, though weary, begin to yearn not just for safety, but for peace. Not just for survival, but for freedom. And when longing becomes strong enough, when suffering ripens, the universe seems to answer. One day a traveler arrives at the village gate. His robe is simple, his steps unhurried. His face carries no trace of fear. The villagers warn him urgently, almost desperately, do not go into the forest. There is death waiting there. But the monk only smiles gently, as if hearing not a warning, but an invitation. The traveler moves through the village as if he belongs to both the earth and the sky. His steps make no sound, yet every villager feels his presence. Children peek from behind doorways, curious and cautious. Elders whisper among themselves, wondering if he is a fool or a sage. He doesn't carry a weapon. There is no glint of armor, no shield to protect against the forest's deadliest inhabitant, just a simple staff and a calm presence, radiating a serenity that seems almost impossible in a place so dominated by fear. The villagers, desperate for guidance, gather around him. They tell the story of the snake, their voices hurried and shaking, punctuated by sobs and gasps. It strikes without warning, it kills without remorse. No one is safe. They speak of nights spent awake, of lives constrained by dread, of children who dare not play beyond the village square. The monk listens. Not with judgment, not with impatience, not with disbelief, but with a quiet attentiveness that somehow makes their fear feel less suffocating. When the stories are finished, he does not speak of hunting or killing. He does not offer charms or magic. He simply asks one question, soft yet unwavering. Have you ever tried compassion? The villagers look at one another, puzzled. Compassion? In the face of this deadly serpent, they shake their heads. One brave man mutters, "Compassion will not stop it. Only force can protect us." The monk's eyes, gentle but piercing, meet theirs. "You mistake fear for reality," he says. "You see danger everywhere because your hearts are filled with dread. But what if there is another way? What if the venom you fear most lies not in the fangs, but in your own minds?" Silence falls. The villagers, unaccustomed to such words, feel a flicker of something unfamiliar, a glimmer of possibility. Could it be that strength does not always come from fighting, that courage does not always demand violence, that even the deadliest threat could be met without hatred, without aggression? The monk walks toward the edge of the forest, and the villagers follow, hesitant yet compelled. He stops at the line where trees meet fields, where shadow meets light. "The snake lives here," he says. "Do you want it gone, or do you want to understand it?" His question hangs in the air. Heavier than any hiss, louder than any fear. Understanding, the villagers have never considered it. They have spent their lives reacting, not observing. They have spent nights trembling, not thinking. And then the monk kneels, his hand resting lightly on the earth. He closes his eyes, breath slow and steady, and for a long moment the forest seems to hold its breath too. Birds stop mid-flight, leaves hang in silence. Even the distant rustle of the snake somewhere in the shadows seems to pause as if curious. Compassion, the monk whispers, is not weakness. It is the power to transform fear into peace, venom into protection, hatred into understanding. Watch and see. At that instant, something shifts in the air, a subtle, almost imperceptible change. The forest does not roar, the snake does not strike, yet the villagers sense it. A quiet power has arrived, a force more formidable than any weapon. The kind of power that can heal, that can change, that can awaken even the most hardened hearts. For the first time in generations, the village feels a tremor of hope. And as they watch the monk, steady and fearless at the forest's edge, they realize that the journey ahead is not about defeating the snake, but about discovering the strength that has always lain within themselves. The forest holds its breath. The villagers watch, hearts pounding, as the monk steps carefully among the trees. He does not brandish a stick, he does not shout, he does not chase. He simply walks with a calmness so profound that it seems to ripple through the shadows themselves. Deep within the underbrush, the snake stirs. Its eyes, sharp and wary, fix on the intruder. Every muscle tenses, ready to strike. For generations, it has survived through fear and violence. Its venom is legendary, its reputation terrorizing. The villagers' stories are nothing compared to the reality of its fangs, coiled and ready, a force of pure survival. And yet the monk does not flinch. He kneels at a distance, lowers his gaze, and begins to speak not in words of command, but in a quiet hum of life itself. There is no threat in his voice, no aggression, only presence. The villagers can barely breathe. They expect an attack. A flash of death, but something unexpected happens. The snake hesitates. Its forked tongue flickers in the air, tasting not blood, not fear, but the calm energy radiating from the monk. Time stretches, each second pregnant with possibility. The monk remains still, steady, allowing compassion to fill the space between them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the snake's coiled tension begins to soften. Its body relaxes, though the eyes remain wary. The venom, sharp and deadly, does not strike, not yet. The monk rises slightly, raising his hand in a gesture of peace. "I see you," he murmurs. "I do not fear you. I honor your life, your instincts, your struggle. You are not my enemy." The forest is silent, the villagers frozen in disbelief. Could it be that fear itself, the energy they had carried for so long, was stronger than any physical danger? Could it be that a mind unmoved by hatred could transform what generations of terror could not? In that moment, something miraculous occurs. The snake, sensing no aggression, no threat, no malice, slowly uncurls. Its eyes, once sharp with hostility, soften just a fraction, enough to reveal the life pulsing beneath its scales. The villagers gasp, some in awe, some in disbelief. A creature that had been the embodiment of fear is no longer a harbinger of death. The monk steps forward a little, never breaking eye contact with the snake. His presence is steady, compassionate, fearless. And then something even the villagers had not dared to imagine happens. The snake lifts its head, flickers its tongue, and does not strike. It watches, curious, cautious, and yet still. It is not tame, it is not a pet. It is alive, fully, beautifully, and no longer solely defined by its venom. The power that had once made it feared, the power of life itself, is acknowledged and respected, not met with hatred. The villagers, who had hidden behind walls and fires for so long, begin to understand fear can only dominate when it is fueled by our own minds. Compassion, even in the face of danger, has the power to transform. It does not destroy, it does not punish. It simply sees clearly, acts wisely, and allows life to shift naturally. And in that quiet, fragile moment, a bridge is built between what terrifies and what heals. The villagers feel a stirring in their own hearts, a recognition that the venom they had feared all along was not only in the snake, but in the way they had allowed fear to rule their lives. The forest exhales. The snake, no longer poised to strike, retreats slightly into the underbrush, watching, learning, alive in a new way. The monk rises fully, turning slowly to the villagers, a soft smile on his face. Compassion does not weaken you, he says. It transforms what seems dangerous into something you can live with, something that teaches. For the first time in decades, the village feels a subtle shift, a sense of possibility, a sense that fear, though still present, is no longer the master of their lives. The snake, once the embodiment of terror, has become a mirror, reflecting the power of understanding, the strength of compassion. And as the villagers absorb this profound lesson, a thought takes root: if one life, one heart, one conscious mind can transform even a creature as deadly as this, then perhaps the same power lies within them, within all of them. The village buzzed with a cautious excitement. For the first time, whispers were not only of fear, but of wonder. The snake, once the shadow of dread, now lingered at the forest edge, a living testament to the power of compassion. Mothers allowed children to peek closer to the trees, and farmers ventured further into the fields, hearts beating with a fragile, unfamiliar hope. Yet, as with all beginnings, the purity of transformation can be easily misunderstood. Some villagers, emboldened by the snake's restraint, began to test boundaries. Children, unaware of the delicate dance between trust and instinct, threw sticks too close to the snake. A farmer, impatient and skeptical, sought to touch it, thinking familiarity meant safety. And the snake, though it had softened, was not blind. Its venom had not vanished, its instincts had not disappeared. It recoiled, hissed, and struck, not with the lethal intent of old, but with a warning that boundaries must be respected. The villagers, witnessing this, panicked. Fear returned, tinged now with confusion and frustration. Why did it strike? They asked. We were being kind. This is the paradox of compassion. It can be misread, misapplied, and misused if wisdom does not accompany it. In Buddhist thought, compassion, K-A-R-U letter 1E47A macron, is inseparable from understanding, prajna. To offer kindness without discernment is to invite suffering, both for oneself and for those we wish to protect. The monk, observing from a distance, called the villagers together. His voice was calm, yet carried a weight that drew immediate attention. You see, he began, the snake has not betrayed you. It has acted according to its nature. Compassion is not the absence of caution, nor the denial of reality. It is the ability to act with wisdom, recognizing the needs and limits of all beings. He walked slowly to the center of the gathered crowd, hands open, palms upward, a gesture of invitation, not dominance. Your hearts were filled with courage, but also with assumptions. You thought the snake's transformation meant it could be treated as harmless, but life does not work that way. True compassion balances love with awareness, kindness with vigilance. A hush fell over the villagers. Their earlier elation mingled with a dawning understanding. Compassion alone is not enough. It must be paired with insight, patience, and respect for the natural order of life. The venomous snake had taught them this lesson in the most literal sense, yet its message resonated far beyond the forest. Children, wide-eyed, began to grasp that being gentle does not mean being careless. Adults, nodding, recognized that fear could return not because of danger alone, but because of ignorance. And in this recognition, a deeper respect for life, human and non-human alike, took root. The monk smiled softly, sensing the subtle shift in the villagers' hearts. Compassion misunderstood is not failure, he said. It is an opportunity to grow wiser, to act with clarity, and to honor the lives around you. The snake is a teacher, not merely a threat, and every challenge you face is a reflection of the lessons yet to be learned. In the days that followed, the village moved cautiously, not with fear, but with attentive care. Children learned to observe rather than provoke. Farmers approached their work with mindfulness, aware of the living world around them. And the snake, respected and unthreatened, coexisted quietly, a living reminder that transformation requires both patience and understanding. The villagers began to see that compassion, when combined with awareness, is a force more enduring than fear, more potent than aggression, more transformative than any sword or shield. And slowly they realized that this lesson applied not only to the snake, but to every challenge in life, every fear, every conflict, every moment when the heart must choose between reaction and understanding. Weeks passed and the village began to breathe more freely. The constant edge of fear had softened into a cautious respect. Children played closer to the forest, farmers tended their fields with a steady rhythm, and even the elders allowed themselves moments of quiet reflection without clutching at the nearest stick for protection. Yet beneath this fragile peace, subtle tensions lingered, misunderstandings, impatience, and the occasional lapse of judgment. It was during this delicate balance that the monk returned, not with urgency, not with reprimand, but with the same calm presence that had first drawn the villagers' attention. His robe was lightly dusted with earth, his eyes serene, and his smile gentle yet knowing. He was greeted with a mixture of relief and curiosity. Many had questions, some carried unease about the snake. The villagers recounted their experiences since his departure, the moments of harmony, the missteps, and the small sparks of fear that had flared when assumptions collided with reality. The monk listened, nodding thoughtfully. When the recounting concluded, he spoke softly, yet every word struck with clarity. "You have learned courage and patience," he said. "You have begun to see the power of compassion, but there is a deeper understanding yet to be grasped. Compassion is not merely the restraint of action, nor the forgiveness of harm. It is also the wisdom to recognize limits, to discern when to act and when to wait." He paused, letting the words settle. Then he addressed the villagers directly. "The snake obeys the natural laws of life. It does not know malice, only instinct and self-preservation. You have learned to meet it with gentleness, yet gentleness alone is not sufficient. There is strength that accompanies compassion, strength that does not strike blindly, but holds the power to protect and guide without harming. That is the lesson before you now." The villagers listened, some nodding, some frowning in thought. The lesson was subtle, yet profound. Mercy and kindness are not powerless. They can coexist with firmness, with boundaries, with clarity. To act compassionately does not mean abandoning wisdom or allowing oneself to be naive. The monk then led them to the forest's edge once more. The snake, aware of his return, emerged cautiously, coiling and flicking its tongue with measured awareness. It was the same snake, yet something had shifted. Its movements were deliberate, its tension restrained, not subdued, but tempered by respect and recognition. "Notice," the monk said, turning to the villagers, "how it holds its power without striking, how it is alive and aware. Compassion allows the snake to transform, but wisdom ensures the safety and harmony of all involved." A young boy raised his hand timidly. "But what if someone makes a mistake? What if the snake bites?" The monk's gaze softened. "Then compassion must be paired with understanding. To forgive without discernment is to invite harm. To act with kindness without awareness is incomplete. True strength is measured not only by gentleness, but by the clarity of one's mind and the courage of one's heart." The villagers began to see the delicate balance. The snake, a creature once feared for its lethal power, had become a teacher of resilience, respect, and mindful action. Their fear had not vanished entirely, but it had been transformed into vigilance tempered by calm, awareness joined with care. The monks smiled, sensing the subtle awakening in their hearts. "Remember this," he said. "Fear, anger, and misunderstanding will always return if the mind is not trained. Compassion alone can soften the heart, but only wisdom can guide it. The two together form a shield stronger than any weapon, a light brighter than any fire, and a power more enduring than fear itself." As he departed again, the villagers watched in quiet reflection. The forest seemed less ominous, the shadows less threatening, and within each heart a new understanding took root, that true compassion is not passive, but alive, dynamic, and intertwined with wisdom. The village had changed, subtly but profoundly. Where once fear dictated every movement, now there was cautious respect. Yet the lesson was far from complete. The villagers had glimpsed the power of compassion, but life's greatest teachers often appear not in comfort, but in challenge. One morning, the monk returned quietly, his presence unassuming yet commanding attention. The villagers gathered instinctively, sensing another layer of understanding awaiting them. A snake slithered into view, its scales glinting under the dappled sunlight, calm but alert. "Compassion," the monk began, "is not weakness. Strength alone without compassion is cruelty. Compassion alone without strength is naivety. The balance between the two is where true power lies." He gestured toward the snake. "See this creature. It has learned to temper its instinct with observation. It is not tame, yet it does not strike indiscriminately. It holds its power restrained. Aware, alive, this is the harmony I wish you to understand." The villagers watched, captivated. They had begun to see the analogy, the snake as a mirror of life and life as a mirror of the mind. Fear, anger, aggression, all natural instincts could be transformed if approached with wisdom and tempered by care. Compassion without awareness, however, could lead to harm. Strength without empathy, though effective, could destroy. "In your lives," the monk continued, "you will face countless snakes, people, situations, emotions that seem threatening. Your first instinct may be to strike, to protect, to dominate. But consider this: what is truly powerful, the bite of aggression or the mastery of your own mind? What is lasting, the momentary victory or the enduring harmony created by understanding and care? He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he turned to the villagers individually, his gaze steady and warm. To balance compassion and strength is to meet challenges with a heart that is soft but firm, flexible but unwavering. It is to act decisively when necessary, but never with malice. It is to protect without destroying, to guide without imposing. A young woman raised her hand, her voice trembling. But how do we know when to act with strength and when to act with compassion? The monk smiled. The answer lies in awareness. Observe clearly, listen carefully. Understand the nature of what you face. Compassion without understanding can be exploited. Strength without compassion can blind you to what truly matters. Only when they move together can you respond in a way that transforms rather than harms. The villagers nodded, slowly grasping the delicate equilibrium. The snake, coiled nearby, flickered its tongue, a living demonstration of the principle. Its presence no longer inspired paralyzing fear. Instead, it inspired respect, a recognition that power tempered with awareness need not harm. Remember this. The monk said softly, a heart guided by compassion, anchored in wisdom, is stronger than the sharpest fangs, brighter than the fiercest fire, and more enduring than fear itself. That evening, the village was quiet, yet filled with a new energy. The children played without recklessness, the farmers worked with mindful care, and even the elders who had carried fear for decades felt a profound shift in their hearts. They had begun to understand that life's challenges, like the snake, were not merely obstacles to overcome, but mirrors reflecting the strength and compassion within themselves. And as the sun dipped behind the forest, casting long shadows across the fields, the villagers felt a sense of harmony they had never known, a balance between caution and courage, fear and understanding, action and reflection. It was a lesson that would resonate far beyond the forest, shaping not just how they approached danger, but how they approached life itself. The snake remained at the edge of the trees, a silent guardian, a teacher, and a reminder that the most profound transformations arise when compassion and strength move together as one. The snake lay at the edge of the forest, calm yet alert, a creature that had once embodied terror but now stood as a living testament to transformation. To the villagers, it was no longer merely a beast of danger. It had become a mirror reflecting truths far deeper than its fangs or its venom. In Buddhism, symbols are never mere decoration. They are keys to understanding the mind, the heart, and the nature of life itself. And the snake in this forest had come to represent more than fear. It embodied the poisons that dwell within every human heart: anger, greed, delusion. Its venom, deadly in nature, was a metaphor for the suffering that arises when these poisons take control. The villagers began to see this clearly. Every instinct of fear they had carried, every tension in their muscles, every sleepless night, the snake had reflected it all. Its strikes, though restrained, reminded them that these internal poisons, if left unchecked, could erupt with devastating consequences. And yet, just as the snake had learned to temper its instincts, they too could learn to master their inner shadows. The monk spoke to them one morning, his voice gentle, carrying the weight of timeless wisdom. The snake is more than a creature of the forest. It is a teacher, a mirror, a symbol of what lies within. The venom you feared so deeply exists not only in its fangs, but in the hearts of all beings. Anger, hatred, resentment, they strike like venom when we do not understand them, when we do not temper them with compassion and awareness. He knelt beside the snake, his hand hovering lightly above its scales without touching, a gesture of respect and connection. See how it is alive, alert, but not driven solely by destruction. This is what we seek within ourselves, to acknowledge our fears and impulses, to honor them without letting them control us, to hold the poison and transform it. The villagers listened, captivated. They began to understand that the snake's transformation mirrored a universal truth. No darkness is invincible, no venom eternal. With awareness, patience, and compassion, even the most destructive forces inside and outside could be changed. The snake also symbolized potential. Just as it could shift from terror to tempered presence, human beings, too, could transform their minds. Hatred could become understanding. Greed could become generosity. Ignorance could become wisdom. The forest, once a place of dread, became a classroom of life lessons, where every rustle of leaves whispered insights about the heart, the mind, and the power of conscious choice. Remember, the monk said, standing now, the snake is a reflection of your own mind. Its venom is the suffering you carry. Its temperance is the wisdom you can cultivate. Its presence is an invitation to face what frightens you most and transform it into strength and compassion. This is the path of awakening. Essence of mindfulness, the way of seeing clearly while acting with care. From that day, the villagers began to approach life differently. They watched the snake with respect, neither provoking nor fearing it unnecessarily. and slowly they noticed the same principle applying to themselves. Every fear confronted, every impulse tempered with awareness, every act of compassion guided by discernment became a step toward freedom from their own inner poisons. The forest, once a place of shadow, became a living metaphor. The snake, once a creature of terror, became a teacher of life, and the villagers, once prisoners of fear, began to glimpse the possibility of liberation, not from the snake, but from the venom within their own hearts. The forest had quieted, but the lessons of the snake remained alive in the hearts of the villagers. The fear that once ruled them had transformed into awareness, patience, and understanding. Yet the true test of compassion, as the monk reminded them, was not only in the forest or in the presence of danger, but in the ordinary moments of life. Compassion, they began to see, was not a rare or extraordinary act. It did not always require dramatic confrontation or heroic courage. True compassion is found in the small choices we make every day, how we speak to one another, how we respond to frustration, how we treat the vulnerable, the helpless, or the difficult. The monk spoke to them, his voice calm and steady, carrying the weight of experience and insight. "You have seen what compassion can do when applied wisely," he said. "But now ask yourselves, how will you bring this power into every corner of your lives? Into your homes, your work, your relationships. Fear and anger are not confined to the forest, they follow you everywhere, and so must your awareness and compassion." He told them stories from his travels, of families healed through understanding rather than argument, of communities united by patience instead of judgment, of hearts softened by empathy instead of hardened by pride. The villagers listened, captivated, realizing that the same principles that had tamed the snake could transform their interactions, their work, and even the way they faced their own fears. A farmer, tending to his fields, noticed a neighbor struggling with a stubborn ox. Instead of rushing to criticize or take over, he offered a gentle hand and patient guidance, remembering the lesson of the snake: observe, respect, act with care. A mother, who once scolded her children harshly, paused before reacting, noticing their needs and emotions, allowing kindness to temper her words. Even the elders, who had carried generations of fear, began to offer counsel with understanding rather than fear-driven authority. The monks smiled quietly, watching them practice the subtle alchemy of compassion. Every action rooted in care and awareness transforms not just the world around you, but also the world within. The venom of anger, resentment, and fear begins to fade when met with mindful love. This is the power of compassion in daily life. It heals, it guides, it protects, and it transforms. And so the villagers learned that the forest was not the only place to apply these lessons. The snake had been a teacher, yes, but the forest, the fear, and the venom were all reflections of life itself. Every challenge, every difficult encounter, every situation that provoked frustration or fear was an opportunity to practice the same wisdom they had witnessed in the wild. By acting with care, by observing before reacting, by tempering kindness with discernment, they began to see remarkable changes. Conflicts were resolved with understanding rather than confrontation. Anger lost its grip, fear no longer dictated their choices, and even the youngest children, once timid and anxious, began to explore the world with curiosity and confidence, carrying the lessons of compassion and awareness in their hearts. The monk's final teaching echoed in their minds: compassion is not an abstract ideal. It is a living, breathing force. It exists wherever you allow it to guide your actions. Treat every challenge as your teacher, and every encounter as an opportunity to practice kindness and wisdom together. That is how venom becomes harmless and fear becomes freedom. As the villagers looked around at each other, at the forest, and at the snake now resting peacefully, they realized the truth of these words. The power of compassion was not limited to extraordinary moments of danger. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life, and when cultivated with awareness, it had the capacity to transform not only themselves, but the entire world around them. The forest stands still in the quiet of the evening, its shadows long and gentle, its air thick with the lingering scent of earth and leaves. The snake rests at the edge of the trees, coiled but calm, a living testament to lessons learned and transformations achieved. The villagers walk softly among the fields, their hearts lighter, their steps steadier. And the monk, as always, moves quietly, observing not only the creatures of the forest, but the lives of those who dwell within it. This is where the story finds its echo, not in the striking of fangs, nor in the sharpness of fear, but in the enduring quiet that follows understanding. The snake, once a symbol of terror, now embodies a truth far greater, that life in all its complexity mirrors the mind. Venom, anger, fear, they are not just external threats, they are reflections of the poison we sometimes carry within ourselves. Compassion, tempered with wisdom, is the antidote. It does not conquer through force, but through clarity and understanding. It does not erase danger, but transforms the way we relate to it. And this, the villagers now know, is a power far stronger than fear. The lessons of the forest extend beyond its borders. Every challenge we face in life, the conflicts, the frustrations, the fears, can be approached with the same mindful care. When we observe clearly, act with awareness, and temper kindness with discernment, even the most threatening forces become opportunities for growth. The monk turns to the villagers one last time, his eyes calm and knowing. "Remember this," he says softly. "Each of you carries a forest within your heart. Each of you carries snakes, fears, doubts, anger, and uncertainty. How you meet them determines the course of your life. Compassion without understanding is like water without direction. It may soothe, but it cannot transform. Strength without compassion is like fire without light. It may burn, but it cannot illuminate. True wisdom comes when the two move together, when the heart and mind act in harmony." The villagers listen, silent, absorbing the weight and simplicity of the truth. They have seen it in the snake, in themselves, and in the quiet strength of the monk, that life's venom can be transformed, that fear can be met without surrendering to it, that compassion, when tempered with awareness, is the greatest power any being can possess. And so, as the sun sets beyond the forest, casting its golden glow over the village, there is a sense of peace, not born of absence of danger, but born of understanding. The forest continues to whisper, carrying the echoes of lessons learned, the quiet song of compassion, and the enduring rhythm of mindful awareness. For the snake remains at the edge of the trees, not as a threat, but as a teacher. The villagers, once prisoners of fear, now walk freely, carrying with them the knowledge that the venom within the world and within themselves can be met, transformed, and transcended. And perhaps as you listen to this story, you too can hear the echo of the forest within your own heart. The fears you carry, the doubts that rise, the anger that lingers, they are not enemies to be destroyed, but teachers to be understood. Meet them with compassion, temper that compassion with wisdom, and discover, as the villagers did, that even the most poisonous forces can become sources of strength, insight, and profound transformation. Because in the end, the forest, the snake, the villagers, and the monk, all of it is a mirror. And the true journey is not to escape the world's venom, but to awaken the power of compassion and wisdom within yourself. If this story touched something deep within you, consider joining us on this journey of wisdom and compassion. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom and allow each video to guide you a little closer to peace, clarity, and mindful living. Share your thoughts, reflect on what you've heard, and remember, every moment is an opportunity to awaken compassion in your heart. Together, let us explore the path of understanding, one story at a time.